Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear through this. I think a number of issues that have already been mentioned in connection with the East Anglia and North are relevant to the case in London. I'll just whiz through this. I think a lot of this will be known to you anyway, but it's intended to engender a little bit of discussion and debate about what's going on. As I say, well known that London is UK's leading growth economy, 10 million population by 2030 estimated. Local government, both at the level of the GLA, the Mayor and the London boroughs, takes a proactive role, but in many ways, as the Mayor of London has recently stated, it's proactivity without bite. It's a kind of light proactivity where you're trying to achieve things but constantly constrained by lack of opportunity created by the institutional arrangements, by the ambiguities of government, and by the complexities of the governance system, which we'll have a look at in a moment. The Mayor has a strategic role, and it's precisely that strategic role which gives the impression of a lot of action and a lot of activity and a lot of proactivity. But being strategic and limited largely, not exclusively, but largely to a strategic role does actually restrain what you can do and what you can achieve. And how far the GLA and the Mayor at the top level, as opposed to the London Borough level, can actually make a positive impact is very much determined, I would argue, by that tension between strategic authority and lack of ability to institutionally express that and create value, create public value. Lots of discussion about this one. Tony Travers constantly saying that the Mayor of London is one of the UK's most influential politicians, but given what I've just said, we need to look at that in a more kind of considered way, that there are constraints on what the Mayor can do. And if we compare what Sadiq Khan can achieve with the sort of powers that the Scottish Government has been accruing over the last few years, it's probably true to say that the London Mayor is far more constrained than Nicola Sturgeon. So, you know, very often the two are compared without too much real consideration of the context. Or, therefore, the other narrative would be that it's a kind of frustrated role, that you have a high profile, you are able to be strategic, and there are some important things going on in the field of, for example, housing, which I'll relate to in just a moment. So you can achieve things, but there's this constant tension. And the contestation over the last 40 years of the governance arrangements in the capital city is, I think, at the heart of that issue. As Neil Brenner, a political scientist, has pointed out on a number of occasions, and a geographer, there has been a constant flux of approaches to how the capital is governed. I hardly need to go into the history, but if we look at the fate of the Greater London Council, the attempt by the Blair government to actually, to a certain extent, provide a corrective to the abolition of the GLC. But more than that, it's about the constant inability by governments, both at the local and national level, to create a settlement, to create what in the United States would be regarded as a normal way of conducting urban governance. So if we compare London with New York, Pittsburgh, where I've got a certain amount of experience looking at the Pittsburgh system of governance, they have a settled urban governance system which has been in place largely without direct political contestation of the powers and institutional arrangements for 40 or 50 years. Whereas in London, this is perpetually in flux. The uncertainty which Lewis referred to earlier on, about not having a document to guide you through what's going on, kind of underscores the situation more recently. Kahn's latest push for devolution, it's vital that we have greater control over how the capital is run. So we have more control over the things we need to improve our cities, such as skills, training, housing, business rates, and the tools to tackle air quality, health and crime. So I think that kind of context that I've just outlined puts that statement into its setting. The GLA was established in 2000 as a kind of corrective to Thatcher's policy of abolishing the GLC, which was arguably a highly politically motivated, I shall use the word, attack on local government. However, Blair, being the sort of person he was, I suppose, very cleverly, I think, built in a constraint which would ensure that there wasn't going to be a new GLC. And so we have this unique local government entity, a 25-member assembly, the GLA having the strategic role, but without the kind of bite that I mentioned before that the GLC to a certain extent had. Services are mainly delivered by bodies other than the GLA. It has authority over functional bodies such as, for example, Transport for London. So the actual delivery of services is carried out by others. And even though the Mayor of London has oversight and considerable amount of control to a certain extent over the appointments within the functional bodies, it's still the case that it's an executive role. It's not actually a delivery body. So the Mayor holds executive power in the GLA, but the Assembly can block and amend the Mayor's budget. Other than this, the Assembly has no power to block the Mayor, but does have a scrutiny role via subject-based scrutiny committees. Now, without getting too much into detail on this, and I'm aware of my time constraint, it's been stated, it's been argued by a number of people, both practitioners and academics, that it is not possible to make generalisations about the fields in which the GLA and the Mayor are in fact able to influence. The policy fields, housing, transportation, emergency planning, police, fire and so on, each of those policy areas can be analysed and looked at as having their own particular patterns of interactions and policy outcomes. We can't generalise, I would argue, about all of those policy areas. It's an incredibly complex governance system which has distributed powers, different levels of influence, different political influence at the particular levels. And so the functions of the Mayor differ across the policy areas. You can't say that the Mayor has a particular strategic function which is this. because it actually varies over each of those important areas that we've mentioned. I'm aware of my time constraint. The Mayor produces strategies but does not deliver services, so housing, education, health and so on. And when you see this on the internet, my slides go into the housing case as an example of some of the complexities which are involved in that policy area. And the point being there is that those complexities make the task of devolution particularly problematic and complicated, because there is already in housing a degree of substantial devolution to the London boroughs, and the London boroughs want to have a stake in the devolution project as well. So who do we devolve to when we're talking about devolution in London? Is it more power and authority to the London boroughs, or is it more power and authority to the GLA and to the Mayor, which would presumably conflict with any devolution to the boroughs? And as Lewis was saying, in terms of has this been sorted out and documented, and is there a white paper on this or anything to give us guidance? There is none. The coalition government has already agreed, or had already agreed, to devolve additional powers to the Mayor over the release of public sector land for housing, over skills funding, some enhanced planning powers. The Congress of Leaders in 2015 made a proposal for additional powers. That's the Congress which involves the Mayor of London plus the London Borough Mayors. And there have been devolution pilots in health, and there is some devolved funding for housing, similar to the kind of thing that Lewis was talking about earlier on. I would point you to, because I'm again aware of my time constraint, the London Finance Commission, which really stirred up a lot of the discussion about devolution. The Tony Travers report for the last Mayor, Boris Johnson, in 2013, stated that central government was too tightly controlling local authorities throughout the UK, not just in London. There was a need for greater local autonomy. London should be able to borrow more for infrastructure projects, etc. All property taxes should be devolved to London, and London should have a role in income tax. And there was also an interesting article in the Financial Times at that time. This is the famous article, Capital Gains Fuel Visions of Breakaway London. This was the report of the Travers London Finance Commission, as it was reported in the Financial Times. It was quite an amusing article, looking to the potentiality, if those devolved powers were actually realised, of an independent republic of Greater London. But we've already had one of those, and I think it was in Sheffield, South Yorkshire, a few years ago, 20 or 30 years ago. Almost my final point now is that you've therefore got this kind of multi-scalar governance, which makes the notion of devolution, quote unquote, problematic. This is a little chart which you can find on the internet, which the LSE have put together for different governance structures in different cities throughout the world. They do one for Tokyo, one for Barcelona, one for London. You can find them all there. And it shows that the complexity of London governance makes this devolution issue more complicated across particular services. I won't go into that in detail, but if you look at the way in which it's presented, it takes transport, other services, police and security, fire and emergency, and shows how these operate at different scales. So you're needing to get 32 London boroughs and the Corporation of London, plus the GLA and the Mayor of London, au fait with coordinating different services at different levels. And there's another point made by Neil Brenner, who I mentioned before, that very often it's a multi-scalar approach and not a multi-level approach that we should be taking into account. So it's quite possible for a London borough not just to articulate at the local level or local scale, but it's now increasingly likely that a London borough will articulate globally. So it actually has a scalar representation at the global level. A lot of the London boroughs are incredibly active in terms of attracting international capital, international investment, overseas investment and so on. If you look at Tower Hamlets and Newham Council, for example, was recently described by the late Clive Dutton, who's the head of inward regeneration there, as a city within the capital city. So if we're talking about devolution, we may be talking about devolution to cities within the capital who don't want to be regarded as just another London borough. So that's worth thinking about. So even though there's this local level, you could put the London boroughs at the top of the scale when they're articulating globally. You'll find a case study on housing in the slides, so if they are going to be going to put it on the internet, I would invite you to have a look at that. Fascinating area, housing, incredibly complicated. The multi-scalar dimension to that makes it very difficult to actually come to a devolution agreement on housing. Everybody wants to, as was mentioned with the presentation on the North, everybody wants to have a finger in the pie, and people tend to get left out and feel sore about that. So Sadiq Khan has an incredibly important diplomatic role to play in coordinating the GLA, his own role, the London boroughs, and the cities within a city. You know, it's a kind of American-style edge city phenomenon that we're getting in places like Newham and in places like Tower Hamlets. The housing case study is there. I'll flip through that. My conclusions: the mayor can, I think, make a positive difference, especially perhaps developing the strategic role and having an oversight over that whole complex governance, multi-level, multi-scalar system. I think he is beginning to show that he has an appreciation of that, which is really quite interesting. There is scope for more devolvement, but what does that actually mean? People are going to have to sort this out. There are a variety, which I've made a note of cross-border alliances, collaborative working groups, groups that sometimes cross outside of Greater London and into the other local authorities, collaborative arrangements, core cities group, for example, which is talking about devolution and so on. So what are we talking about? What is the handle on this? Can we actually achieve something like an American urban settlement, or something of the sort that Barcelona or Munich have, which is a much more settled institutional set of arrangements that haven't become so hotly politicised. Delegated authority and strategic thinking has already been taking place, and partnership working, which was mentioned previously by Lewis's presentation, is very important. So I've rest the case there. I can go on all day about this. You'll have to stop me now, and thank you very much for your attention.